What you've heard here today are suggestions or even questions about war crimes, possible war crimes appropriate?
Given what we know about the facts of this second strike, there are serious legal questions here. And that's even if you take the Trump administration at their claim that we are in an armed conflict with these drug cartels, which a lot of people say, we are not in an armed conflict as that is defined under policy and law. But even taking their claim that we are in an armed conflict, this still raises serious legal concerns because the facts as we know them are that these survivors of the first strike were, essentially clinging on to remnants of the boat. And in that situation, the law of naval warfare, the law of armed conflict would say that those people, they're not a threat. They're not an imminent threat. So there's not a self-defense issue. And rather that they would get protection under the law of the sea. And so there we're talking about, even if we are in an armed conflict, that could be a war crime. And when you have customary international law that is incorporated into U.S. domestic law, it could also be murder. Wow. Which is that's a serious thing.
Yeah. We heard the president today during the cabinet meeting raise the possibility of land strikes. How serious of an escalation would land strikes be in this situation?
Well, certainly I think to the Venezuelan government and the Venezuelan people, it would seem to be very significant. I think when it comes to the legal issues raised from the second strike, honestly, you would have similar concerns if it were on land or on sea. Generally, the law of armed conflict doesn't allow you to sort of, have, take no quarter strikes where, if there are survivors like this who are not posing a threat, you don't just wipe everybody out without there being consequences. And whether those consequences come from congressional oversight, which obviously under our constitutional democracy, that is Congress's role. So I'm pleased to see that there are talks of investigating and Congress taking on that constitutional oversight role, or through the Court of Military Justice when it comes to the admiral who is potentially involved here, or because Secretary Hegseth is a civilian himself, legal consequences could come through the U.S. legal system.
Well, there are a lot of questions about evidence in this case. The press secretary earlier today at the Pentagon had said they are 100% confident that these are drug smuggling vessels. We haven't seen the evidence, though, and the admiral's about to testify before the Armed Services Committees on Thursday, and I'm sure they'll have some difficult questions for him. But if you were preparing a case, if you were going into a courtroom, what questions would you have and what evidence would you need to see?
Oh, there are so many questions.
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, as you said, we have not really seen a lot of evidence that these boats are smuggling drugs, that they are smuggling drugs that are related to the fentanyl crisis that the president has invoked, that are aimed at the United States. And even if they were drug smuggling boats, you still would have legal procedures and protocol that you need to follow when you are engaging in deadly strikes.
Like boarding the vessels.
Yes, I mean, normally this sort of interdiction of drug smugglers would be exactly, that they would seek to stop the boat, board the vessel, and we've seen before that in many cases when they do that, they find that they are not actually drug smugglers. So, having that, semblance of due process before engaging in deadly action, where you're basically judge, jury, and executioner all in one moment. But even if they are drug smugglers, again, the questions are whether what happened in this particular case is illegal under international law and whether it violates constitutional safeguards where, we only allow the executive to engage in these sorts of military strikes under very limited circumstances. So if this is a longer term, more involved conflict, then Congress really should be getting involved in its constitutional duty as the one that declares war.
We saw the president recently issue a pardon for former Honduran President Juan Hernandez, who was serving a prison sentence for drug trafficking at the same time that the U.S. is striking these boats over drug trafficking. I wonder, is that an appropriate use of the pardon power to pardon this former Honduran president?
Well, it certainly raises a question of, I guess, consistent intent. We've seen President Trump through tariff policies against Canada and Mexico, which he has said he's put in place in part because of the drug crisis of fentanyl crossing the borders. And of course, what we've been talking about now, these strikes on the boats that he says are drug smugglers. So then to pardon someone who has been convicted of, very serious, massive drug smuggling efforts doesn't really seem to be consistent. And, I think that's something that the American people should really be watching because, we want our elected leaders of every political stripe to be held accountable to the rule of law. And the pardon power is something that the president has broad discretion in using. But, the political consequences could come in addition to, what legal consequences might come from the actual decision to order those strikes. But the pardon power is very broad. The president has discretion, but whether it sits well with the American people is a separate question.
I never thought we'd be sitting here having this conversation with Elizabeth Wydra because with your experience before the Supreme Court, that's typically what we're talking about. And we're certainly waiting for some major rulings here. The next big one that's on our radar and for many investors is the ruling on President Trump's tariff regime. That could come at any moment, we're told. What are your expectations on timing and what should we be looking for when that rolls out?
Absolutely. So normally big cases like this take, months and months. Sometimes, we'd be talking about before the term ends in June. But the Supreme Court really fast-tracked the tariff case. It went from initial request for review to argument in a matter of weeks, which might not seem super fast to the average observer, but in Supreme Court timing, that is lightning fast. So most of us are expecting to get a ruling before the end of the year. So given that it's December, here we are. I think the big questions will be, does the Supreme Court apply this doctrine that it has created that says when the executive does something that has broad political or economic consequences for the nation, it needs to be done under an express delegation from Congress. It can't be this kind of interpretation of congressional law. And clearly Congress has not said, you may apply tariffs in this exact situation. And so if the court applies that doctrine, which it did to President Biden's student loan policy, for example, student loan forgiveness, then I think the tariffs fall. If they don't apply it, then I think it's a more open question about whether the tariffs survive. Certainly at oral argument, it seemed as if the history behind the statutes that the president has been invoking to justify the tariff policies, the justices seem to find some holes, some pretty big holes in the administration's argument. But, I think we're going to look to see what Chief Justice Roberts does, what Justice Amy Coney Barrett and Justice Gorsuch, Justice Kavanaugh, where they stand on this issue.